And we're back. George Norrie with you. Welcome back to More Open Lines. And let's go to Mitchell in San Diego, California. Mitchell, thanks for holding so long.
George, I'd like to talk about the Middle East, if I may.
Okay, sir. Go ahead.
Tom, you had an earlier caller said that Israel being right there is not a good idea. And I think the reason that the world gave them Israel was because we didn't have the guts as a world to apologize for the Holocaust. To this day, that's never been done. And if you were a Jew and that happened to your people, that would take precedence over everything you did.
I'd be outraged if it happened to my people. I'd be outraged.
Yeah, you would make sure that never happened to your people again. You would sew up the media, the banks, the everything, which they have done. And I think as an alternative, because what Netanyahu's doing, he's setting the stage up for an equal and opposite reaction. He's going to get nuked because what he's doing to Gaza today, it's going to be the natural result of what he's doing. And it's going to force them to have to leave. But I have a better idea.
What's that?
Well, first of all, Netanyahu says that he's going to stop the bombing after the hostages are released. Does anyone believe that? That's when the bombing's going to really start. So he has no credibility, and
it sounds like you're not a Netanyahu fan. It sounds like.
Well, I think that a separation of church and state is being violated with our support of Israel, and I think by supporting Israel, we are alienating all the Islamic world against us, just the way we alienated Japan, Korea, and Vietnam in those wars. And I think someone's pulling our strings in that respect. In fact, the Rosenbergs gave the Soviets our secrets while we were giving them Israel. And if you were a Jew, you would notice that the Soviets went into Hitler's bunker and killed him, and while the Americans harbored Nazis after the war. So we have a mess on our hands here, and the best thing I've read on the subject, if I may give your readers a tip, is found in the editorial section of LeninMurderTruth.com.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, but I've got to tell you this. Israel was attacked on October 7th, and it never should have happened at all. If there are things that needed to be negotiated, it should have happened through the United Nations. Somebody should have brought some issues forward. But to kill innocent people, victims, babies, putting them in ovens, I don't have to go through a litany of things that we know about. It's uncalled for. It really is. So I think you're in the minority there, Mitch. Bill in Los Angeles, take it away. Hey, Billy.
Hey, George. How you doing?
Good. How have you been?
Okay. By the way, I think that previous caller, he sure sounds like that guy who's been hoaxing your show off and on the last couple of years. I think that's the same guy.
He might be. Yeah.
This John Lennon nonsense is the same guy. But I was going to mention a couple of war movies from Hollywood that kind of intersected with my own life in an indirect way. You remember a movie called Pride of the Marines from 1945?
I sure do. Yep, a classic.
Yeah, and it's one of the few Hollywood movies that's actually true to reality. And you may remember he lost his eyesight on Guadalcanal while he and his buddy mowed down 500 Japanese attackers during the night, and they triumphed. In the morning, he was blind. His buddy had lost, I think, his hands, and he held the machine gun while his buddy spotted for him, and they won that battle against the Japanese. And it's a great story about the VA. And the part that intersected with my life was that there's a nurse, her last name was Pfeiffer, who inspired the John Garfield character, the real-life character, to overcome his depression. And that woman was the mother of my childhood best friend.
Small world, Bill.
Yeah. And actually, that guy went to Columbia J School the year before I did, and because of him, I went there too. And then the other movie, I'm sure you remember Clint Eastwood's Heartbreak Ridge.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm a diehard Clint Eastwood fan. And by the way, you may know he's a Korean War vet, and kudos to him. You know, he's my hero.
Yep.
But that movie was kind of a turkey in a number of ways. I was assigned as a reporter for the Orange County Register in 1986 to watch that with a bunch of real-life combat veterans from Korea and World War II, including a Medal of Honor winner, retired Marine Colonel William Barber. That name may sound familiar to some of your Orange County listeners, and I think he died a few years ago. But I watched that movie with him and a couple other guys, and you should have heard these guys take that movie apart, starting with the fact that Heartbreak Ridge was supposed to be a Marine battle, but in fact it was an Army battle in Korea. Like almost everything about that movie, according to these guys, and if you do the research, was wrong. Including everybody's favorite, profanity-laced lines by Eastwood. These guys said nobody talked to anybody like that. The gunnery sergeants didn't use that kind of language with the enlisted men, and they didn't pick fights with people. And they said it was just totally Hollywood. But it was just interesting watching that movie with four guys who were actually, combat veterans.
Absolutely. Hollywood, by the way, has settled the SAG-AFTRA strike. That means more and more TV shows and movies get going again. It's about time. Mark in Wisconsin, take it away. Hi, Mark.
Hi, George. How you doing?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, and happy Veterans Day to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to something I heard Dannion say about reinstituting a draft.
Okay.
I think that would be a really good thing to do for these kids in the colleges that don't know nothing, and stick them in the Army, let them do a little battle and see what the real world is like. They're obviously oblivious of what is really going on.
Well, the draft during Vietnam created such tension with people. I'm not sure. As long as we can get enough people on the volunteer end of this, we don't need a draft. Now, if that were changing, if we couldn't get enough volunteers in, then we'd have to put in a draft to be that. But, gosh, I remember during the Vietnam days, the draft was horrible. And my draft number was 20, which meant I was going to Vietnam, so I went and got my physical. And I had a slight heart murmur when I was a kid. Didn't really affect me, but I had it. And they spotted it. And they said, "You're not eligible to go in the military." And I went, "What?" I was still in my last year of college, but I went through the draft process. And I was upset, but I was also kind of fortunate at the same time. I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I wasn't as brave as some of the other people that did go. And I got out. And then years later, I got a direct commission to go into the Navy. And they checked the heart murmur, and they said, "No, it's fine. You're okay." And I went. But I'm not so sure, Mark, a draft would work these days. I mean, if we have, Mark, let me ask you this. If we have a volunteer army, why do we need a draft?
Well, maybe it'd straighten up the ideas of some of these younger kids that just don't know what the world is like.
Well, I don't know if a draft would do that or not, or make them more angrier. It's a very strange situation. Let's go next to Brother Don in Kent, Ohio. Hey, Donald, welcome to the show.
Hey, God bless you, George, and happy Sabbath. I want to thank you for your service and all your veterans for the sacrifices that they've made.
Thank you.
I understand about Israel. God gave that land to them. It doesn't matter if he gave it to them yesterday. The only thing the Palestinians should ask is, number one, what do you accept for conversion, and how much is the rent structure? Because the land belongs to them. The Dome of the Rock was built in the 7th century on top of the second Jewish temple. The second Jewish temple was built on top of the first Jewish temple, which goes back to about the 10th century B.C. This land has been in constant Hebrew use until they were scattered, of course, by Titus' army, the Roman army, in 70 A.D. with the destruction of the temple. So, people have to put their perspectives in order. It's God's willingness to give that land to keep for eternity.
Well said, my friend, and it's an issue that has not been solved in thousands of years, has it?
No, and you got to remember, Israel is a tiny country surrounded by over 800 million radical Muslims. It's the only country in the history of the world that kept the true Bible Sabbath. That's Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, the time that we're in right now. So God made a promise to those folks if they keep the commandments. It's the fourth commandment. As Catholics, it's called the third commandment because we had to get rid of the second commandment dealing with images. But so they moved everything up and split the 10th into two. So a lot of problems with compromising with the Vatican and that. But the bottom line is that God doesn't want us to fight. He told us that we're going to be plowing the plowshares and our swords will be converted. So we're going to pound our swords and spears into plowshares. We're going to till the land. Everybody's going to live in peace when he returns. It's not going to be too far away.
Well, I would wish we would go into peace because these wars are crazy. Let's go to first-time caller Cy. Happens to be in Madison, Mississippi. Hello, Cy. Welcome to the program.
Hey, George. Thank you so much for taking my phone call.
My pleasure.
I've been listening for a long time, and as you said earlier, first-time caller. I myself am a veteran, but I wanted to say Happy Veterans Day to you and the rest of the veterans listening.
And you
right
too.
now.
Thank you.
I had an interesting story for you. At least a friend of mine told me it's an interesting story.
Okay.
A few days ago.
Let's see what it's like.
Really well, I was actually a part of a operation called Noble Eagle in Washington, D.C., right after September 11th. And in 2012, in June, when I was active duty, I was a Stinger missile operator. And some of your listeners may not know this, but after 2011, for I think 3 to 5 years, possibly, Operation Noble Eagle, we had stations all over D.C. with Stinger missiles, just in case.
Just in case,
another
that's right.
attack. So this has happened a few times since then. It's been many, many years ago, but this is the first time it happened after 9/11. A civilian aircraft flying into what you would, I guess, refer to as a no-fly zone over D.C. I was actually the team chief for the Stinger missile team, me and my gunner, and we were on the rooftop of what is known as the executive building, roughly 150 yards from the White House itself on the night this happened. Now, I wouldn't say this has been covered up. It hasn't, but it was kind of a botched deal because when Noble Eagle first started out, it was a fool's errand almost. The three tiers of defense that we had for D.C. were F-16s, and then after that, Black Hawk helicopters, and the very last tier were Stinger missiles, which what we did. And on this night in July, you can look this up if you'd like, in 2012, a Cessna plane, the pilot had fallen asleep, I believe I was told, in the middle of the night, and was on a beeline straight for the White House, and our position being right next to the White House. Roughly, we came 12 to 13 seconds from being given the command to actually fire the Stinger missile on this civilian plane. And just before that, this guy apparently woke up and realized what was going on.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine what he was looking at when he woke up?
He was at. Well, that was the thing, is that he was in a Cessna plane, the first tier of defense. And of course, I can say this now because I've been a civilian for so long. My top secret clearance is not even an issue. F-16 planes were the first tier of defense, but to buzz, but this airplane. But of course, he's moving such a slow pace in the F-16, he doesn't even know they've been there. The Black Hawks then buzzed him. They were not able to wake him up. And here's I call it funny now because I'm 46 and well out of military years, but just before we were getting the actual radio signal to say, hey, we're about to do something here, the steam from the manholes there in downtown Washington, D.C. started being released. A Stinger missile is heat sinking. So as I'm standing there on the rooftop of a building next to the White House, knowing that in the next minute to 2 minutes I'm about to give my gunner the command to fire a Stinger missile at this unknown civilian airplane, all of a sudden the steam starts rising up, and I'm thinking to myself, we're about to fire a heat-sinking missile in downtown Washington, D.C., and just literally 12 seconds before I'm about to give the command, they called off because the guy waked up.
Oh, that could have gone into the street system.
Could have gone anywhere. Well, we're right next to the White House, but the first family had actually been evacuated. I watched George Bush Jr. play soccer with his Cocker Spaniel in the backyard of the White House many times. But this is a story that a lot of people don't know about. And a friend of mine that I promised I would call and tell y'all about this said that, man, this is just a cool story. And I thought, it is in a way that it wasn't a big deal to me, but after the years have gone by, they've not saying, like I said, they haven't covered it up, but it was a very flawed system. Since then, they've corrected it, but it was a very small, minute speck. And my friend passed away 2 weeks ago, and I gave him my word that I would actually call into you at some point and tell you about this story. And it's a very, it's not an important story. It's an interesting story, I guess, to some folks.
It is fascinating. Thank God the guy woke up, Si.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that they didn't even give him a ticket. I thought at least he would get some sort of a citation or something for flying to the White House and asleep. But he apparently got off scot-free. And years and years after that, I'm 45 now. I was active from '97 to 2004, but I actually was deployed with the National Guard unit in 2012 to D.C. for the Operation Noble Eagle. But while I was there, it was actually, and the second reason I called was to tell you that I don't think they do that anymore, the Stinger missile locations around D.C., but I got a chance to go to the other locations, and one was by the Arlington National Cemetery. There are 5 locations in total, but standing there over the tombstones there in Arlington was really stirring for me on a personal note. But I thought I might just call in and just let you know, because I gave my buddy my word that I would do that, to just give you the interesting story that we came roughly 15 seconds from me being on CNN explaining as to why I shot a Stinger missile at the White House in the middle of the night. And thankfully I didn't have to do that. So, but very close call. A lot of people may not know about that story. They can research if they want to, but it was it's happened a few times since then, I think.
Indeed. Thank you, Si. I appreciate it. Great story, by the way. Joe, Monterey, California. A couple minutes here. Joseph, go ahead.
Well, happy Veterans Day.
Thank you, sir.
And yesterday was the Marine Corps anniversary.
248 years old.
Well, it was also my birthday, too.
But you're not 248, or are you?
That would be a couple of lifetimes.
Indeed. What's up?
I was going to talk about 2 interventions, but I'm only going to say one because I wanted to bring up a little something that people don't think about. The Greys are telepathic, and in Roswell, that crash, they laid in the field for a long, long time. The next day, I believe. How come they didn't come and get them? They knew they were there. They're telepathic, and if they had trouble with their ship, they would have sent out an SOS of some kind.
Well, you would have thought that they came from a mothership that was going around the planet, don't you?
Well, there's so many of them that they would have had no problem in finding them and rescuing them.
Well, that's true, but who knows why they waited so long?
I think they gave us that technology.
Boy, and the beings, too, the bodies?
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting take on all of that. Mm-hmm. Very interesting indeed. All right, Joe, thanks. We're going to come back in a moment. Did you know that there are some people who literally fake their deaths for all kinds of reasons? In a moment, we're going to be talking with an individual about why people fake their deaths, so stand by for that and much more on Coast to Coast AM. Death is part of life. People die every day, but why in the world do people fake their own deaths? Good morning, Elizabeth.
Hi, George. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, I'm looking forward to this. We're keeping you up late. You're on the East Coast, aren't you?
Sure am. Middle of the night over here, but I've had plenty of coffee, and I'm really excited to talk pseudocide.
What an amazing book and subject. Oh, my God. How did you get involved in even writing about this?
Well, there's the short story and the long story, and I'll give you the thumbnail on each. So
okay.
The short story is that I, in 2012, wrote a profile of a man named Frank Ahern, who at the time worked here in New York. And Frank is a quote-unquote privacy consultant. So he is a person who helps people disappear, both physically and digitally. A lot of people bring up that character on Breaking Bad, Walter White in the last season. He's kind of the real-life version of that. Although he claims not to do anything illegal, you can really actually vaporize without resorting to illegal means. So, one of the questions that I kept asking Frank is, well, why would you disappear instead of fake your death if your problems were really that grave, pardon the pun? Because faking your death really means staging some kind of accident or hoax to make it appear that you have perished, that's the end, that's the period, punctuation point on your story. Whereas disappearing means, it's kind of your classic case of dad goes out for cigarettes one day and never comes back. So it's just more open-ended. So my question to Frank was always like, well, why wouldn't you fake your death? And what he kept telling me over and over again was that it's actually a lot easier to get yourself caught if you fake your death instead of disappearing. There's more for investigators to look into the circumstances surrounding your death, especially if you were in some hot water. Usually it's legally, financially, or maritally around the time of your fake death. The way I got to Frank in the first place is because I, like many Americans, have a ton of student loan debt from both my undergraduate and graduate degrees. And I was having dinner with a friend one night when I was in graduate school, and I'd taken out all these loans so foolishly, all my own fault. And I was saying, oh, my gosh, Matt, what am I going to do after graduation when I have to start paying these back? I think I need to just find a country with a really nice beach and no extradition policy and just slip through the cracks. A fantasy probably a lot of us have had at one point or another. And my friend said very offhandedly, meaning nothing of it, he said, or you could fake your own death. And I was like, that's such a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? So I just became very fascinated with the whole concept of how you would do it pragmatically. I'd always heard about death hoaxes like Elvis and Tupac, and I just became totally enraptured with the idea, especially once I met characters like Frank and real people out in the world who deal in disappearance and suicide.
Were you serious about disappearing?
I don't think I was. I mean, I think that it was really more of the fantasy that was very appealing. I always joke that if I'd actually faked my death, my mom would kill me. So I'd be dead right now. I don't think I could ever go through with it.
You'd end up missing the ones you cared about, I think, eventually.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the real reason why so many people end up getting caught isn't because they get their image captured on closed-circuit TV somewhere, and it isn't really a function of the kind of omnipresent surveillance and technology of the world we live in today. It's really because people can't cut ties with their past lives. It's just because they can't stop talking to mom, on her birthday or when they miss her. So it's really kind of a human nature problem why people have a real hard time staying dead when they're supposed to be.
How often, Elizabeth, does this happen where people actually try to disappear?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's a really tough one to answer. So, excuse me, in the case of faked deaths for life insurance purposes, which is a main factor of people who fake their deaths usually. They're trying to cash out on that life insurance policy and, get rich and die trying, as it were. So I spoke with the Coalition of Insurance Fraud Investigators, and these are people who monitor all insurance fraud. So not just life insurance, but Medicaid fraud,
everything,
any kind of fraud you could commit. And they said that just life insurance fraud is less than 1% of what they see on an annual basis. And speaking to fraud investigators, the guys who are kind of like the real-life Indiana Joneses, when there's a fishy case that comes in from some far-flung country, they get on the plane and, traipse out to the village in Mongolia, and they'll dig up empty coffins sometimes. They have pretty amazing jobs. They're investigating usually several dozen of these a year, but these are only really high sticker price frauds, in the realm of the millions that they're investigating, because it's a kind of a cost-benefit analysis for the company. They're not going to be paying these guys thousands of dollars a day.
That's right.
Unless the policy is very high. So the kind of inherent paradox with trying to get a good number on death fraud is that people who do it successfully are simply presumed dead. We don't know. We only hear about the cases that go awry. So with those, just at least American cases, it's around a couple hundred a year.
And do they disappear? Are there fake bodies with the teeth pulled out? What happens?
I mean, you name it. It's pretty amazing. So one of the ways in which people often attempt to commit life insurance fraud, particularly, again, this all kind of goes to your motives of why you're trying to.
Sure. And the benefactor in these cases, Elizabeth, would be whom? The guy's wife or some girlfriend or what?
Indeed. Yes, exactly. So it's typically, a wife, a child, usually someone you're blood related to.
Are they in on the scam?
Yes, they have to be. Unfortunately, you can't collect your own life insurance policy. So that's one of the kind of tricky parts is you need a trusted co-conspirator. And as a lot of the fraud investigators told me, they will always, first thing, go to the person who claimed the money and start interviewing them, and a lot of people break pretty quickly. So you've got to really know who you're getting. He's
hiding under the treehouse. I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. But to answer your first question, so for life insurance fraud purposes, people will get very theatrical, and typically these kinds of cases occur overseas in countries where there's a very robust culture of fraud. So one place that I visited for the book, and that the investigators told me again and again where they see cases coming from right now, is the Philippines. So your average fraudster will go to the Philippines, and you can get so theatrical with your fake death over there. You can purchase a body in a morgue. It can be anything from a black market morgue. Well, they will pick up, dead derelicts off the street and keep them on ice for these purposes. Or you can go into a municipal morgue where they're just very overtaxed and say, "Oh, it's Uncle Marco. We finally found him." Yeah, it's pretty grim stuff. And they take that body and immediately cremate it, and then they will host fake funerals where they will hire, locals, pay them a few bucks to weep over the casket.
Wow. And what about the death certificate? Will you get a phony death certificate? Oh, my God.
That's a big part. So most of the best frauds really don't take place with, these very theatrical kind of scenarios. Because then what they'll do is videotape the funeral and provide all this photo evidence to the life insurance company. But it's really about the documents. There are a lot of documents that go into a death. When you think about it, you have the death certificate. If it was a grisly accident, there's an autopsy report. There's a doctor's, testimony, witness testimony, police reports. So making sure that, and I don't recommend this by any means, but really looking at those documents and getting high-quality documents is really how most death frauds are carried out.
Give us an example of a story of an individual who tried this and, let's say, succeeded, and then maybe one where they got caught.
Well, the problem is, again, for my book, I talked to some people who did fake their deaths, but they all got caught.
They all got caught.
I was talking to them. I unfortunately have not found that holy grail person yet of someone who's presumed dead and wants to talk to me. But, hey, Coast to Coast listeners, if you're out there,
it's right. When we go to calls next hour, they might pop up for you.
That would be great. So one of my favorite stories comes out of the UK, and it's about a man named John Darwin, who, in his own words, he called himself Mr. Boring. He was married to his wife, Anne, at the time, and he was a school teacher. At the time, he was a corrections officer. And he and Anne had gotten themselves into some pretty steep real estate debt. They had taken out mortgages on a lot of different properties and were having trouble paying the notes. They had tenants that weren't paying the rent on time. So they, in John's own words, he realized at a certain point that he was really in over his head and he was worth more dead than alive. So his plan was to cash in on these life insurance policies and pensions that he had. So with the help of his wife, he staged his drowning in a kayaking accident on the North Sea right in front of his home in Seaton, Carew, England, paddled out. He kind of crash-landed a little bit down the beach. His wife, Anne, picked him up in the car, drove him to the train station, where he then took a train to the west coast of England, camped out on the beach for several months. He grew very gaunt and thin and grew this long beard and took on this elaborate disguise. He then actually returned to his own home. They had this amazing Victorian house where they rented out half of it to renters, and they lived in the other half. So he took on the name Carl Fenwick, and as Carl Fenwick, he posed as a renter and had his own room next door. And the houses were connected through a series of stairs. So at night, he would just take these stairs and, go to bed with his wife, and in the morning go back as Carl Fenwick. So they had two adult sons that thought he was dead the whole time. They were not in on this plan. So in the time that John was presumed dead, he managed to obtain an authentic UK passport and the name of a person called John Jones, who was born around the same time as him but died in childhood. And with his passport and with Anne, with his wife, they traveled all over the world to a dozen different countries. They bought property in Panama. And after about 6 years of this, John turned himself in. He was never caught. What he told me was that his whole plan was to kind of use release the liquidity in the homes and the life insurance and pensions to, pay back his debts and then come back and make good. Well, as you can imagine, that's not exactly what happened. He turned himself into a London police station in December 2008, saying that he had amnesia and that he couldn't account for events prior to the year 2000. And that ruse quickly unraveled, within about 24 hours. So he served 3 years and 3 months in prison. Anne actually ended up serving more time than him because she pleaded not guilty. They divorced while they were serving their sentences. But, the amazing thing about John is, I spent about a week with him, in Seaton, Carew, after he was released from prison. And, he showed me exactly where he launched the kayak and the homes and how everything happened. But he's recently remarried, and he actually lives in the Philippines now. So kind of full circle.
Amazing stories at how they would do this. And I guess you have to have a lot of guts, Elizabeth, to want to do this?
Yeah, a lot of guts, or also a lot of self-confidence in a way, kind of suffering from high self-esteem in the sense that you think that you'll be able to get away with it, that you're going to fool, law enforcement,
right,
fraud investigators, that you can really pull the wool over dozens and dozens of highly trained people's eyes. I also think that it really comes down to desperation to go through with it. And that's something that I realized in the course of researching my book, is that student loan debt isn't really that big of a motivation compared to people who find themselves millions and millions of dollars in debt or facing down, pretty severe criminal charges. And you kind of start taking on some fight or flight response. And it was, that's really one that's flight.
Is it fraud to fake your death if you don't have any financial gain?
It's a great question. So faking your death in and of itself is not illegal. So there's no law on the books called faking your own death.
For Dan Galante, Donna Walker, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonewood, Sean Ladasor, Stephanie Smith, Chris Burrows, Tim Banal, George Knapp, Ian Punnett. I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.